General Hospital spoiler reveal that there was something profoundly unsettling about the way Willow's story unfolded, something that didn't align with the version of herself she had always presented to the world. For months, everyone in Port Charles believed she was a gentle, soft-spoken woman incapable of violence, someone who trembled at confrontation and avoided conflict whenever she could. And yet, the night Drew was shot, everything about her behavior contradicted that image, creating a growing list of questions that no one could answer. How could a woman who didn't know how to use a gun suddenly fire precise shots into Drew's back, shots carefully placed to wound him severely, but not kill him? How could a woman overwhelmed by emotion drive through a storm filled with sobs, shaking hands clutching the steering wheel, looking like she was moments away from collapsing, yet only minutes earlier had the clarity, precision, and cold steadiness required to infiltrate the Quartermain mansion, slip on gloves, unlock Edward's office, and steal a firearm without leaving a single fingerprint behind? These contradictions formed cracks in the narrative Willow desperately tried to uphold, cracks that suggested she was not acting alone, and that someone else hidden, calculating, patient was guiding her every move. The flashbacks revealed more than Willow wanted the world to see. In them, she was driving through the rain with tears streaming down her face, her breath uneven, her mind spiraling, repeating something under her breath as if trying to convince herself she had no choice. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her, chaotic, unstable, overwhelming. She looked like someone carrying a weight too large to bear, someone forced to commit an act she could neither morally justify nor emotionally withstand. And yet, the memory that came just before this emotional collapse was disturbingly composed. She moved like someone following instructions, not impulses. She knew exactly where the office key was hidden. She knew the lock's resistance and how to turn it quietly. She knew the precise layout of Edward's office. She walked straight to the drawer where the gun was kept, opened it without hesitation, and retrieved the weapon with the confident efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the action or been coached through it. Her calm, methodical movements followed by the breakdown in the car created a contrast so sharp it began to raise suspicions among those watching closely. Someone had prepared her. Someone had walked her through the steps, possibly more than once. Someone had calculated what needed to happen and used Willow as the instrument. The idea that Willow, even with her past in occult and minor weapons exposure, would flawlessly execute such a sequence alone felt increasingly improbable. And the more people analyzed her actions, the more they realized something wasn't adding up. Her precision inside the mansion and her emotional collapse afterward didn't belong to the same state of mind. It was as if two different versions of Willow existed that night, one cold, disciplined, and determined, the other terrified, fragile, and drowning in guilt. This duality hinted at a presence behind her, a hidden figure influencing her decisions, feeding her instructions, ensuring she completed the task even as her own conscience resisted. The evidence of this hidden support wasn't obvious, but it lingered in the subtle inconsistencies of Willow's story. For example, how did she know the Quartermain security system would be down for maintenance that night? How did she know Drew would be alone and off his guard? How did she know which room he would be in? How did she know she would have just enough time to fire, stage the scene, and flee before anyone arrived? Willow could not have orchestrated all of this on her own, especially while in the emotional state shown in the rain-soaked flashbacks. Someone had been watching the Quartermain household. Someone had studied Drew's schedule. Someone had ensured there were no witnesses. Someone had guided Willow into believing she needed to take action fast, quietly, and without hesitation. And someone had prepared the escape route she used, leaving her only with the emotional aftermath that battered her sanity. This mysterious force behind her was careful, unseen, and intelligent, turning Willow into a pawn in a larger game she barely understood. As investigators and residents of Port Charles looked deeper, the suspicion grew that Willow's involvement was only one layer of a more complex plot. Her breakdown in the car wasn't merely guilt, it was a result of internal conflict between her own morality and the pressure exerted by someone controlling her from the shadows. Her actions inside the mansion felt mechanical, almost dissociated, as if she were repeating steps told to her by someone she feared or trusted, or both. And the moment she completed the task, the real Willow resurfaced, horrified by what she had done. Consumed by panic, her emotions finally breaking through the scripted calm she had been forced to embody. The question became not whether Willow had fired the gun, because clearly she had, but who placed that gun in her hand, who crafted the plan, who whispered instructions into her mind, and who benefited most from Drew's condition. Someone was operating behind her, using her emotional vulnerability, her desperation, and her complicated history with Michael and Nina to manipulate her into becoming the perfect camouflage for a larger scheme. The true architect of the crime remained in the dark, but their fingerprints were metaphorically everywhere, in Willow's uncharacteristic skill, in her suspiciously specific knowledge, in the consistency of her actions, and in the trembling terror that consumed her as soon as she was away from the mansion. Willow had been steered, nudged, or coerced by a force that understood her weaknesses intimately. Someone who knew exactly how to break her down and rebuild her into a weapon, disguised as a desperate woman. And as the truth slowly surfaced, it became clear that the night Drew was shot was not the story of one woman snapping under pressure. It was the story of a silent mastermind pulling strings from the shadows, escalating a dangerous game that was far from over. The deeper everyone looked, the darker the implications became. Because if someone could manipulate Willow this easily, then no one in Port Charles was safe. There was a chilling new theory rising in Port Charles, one that twisted the entire narrative into something darker, more calculated, and far more personal than anyone had dared to admit. What if Willow had not acted alone? What if the calm precision she displayed the night she stole the Quartermain gun was not a moment of instinctual boldness, but the result of training quietly given, secretly taught, deliberately shaped by someone who shared her anger, her fear, or her desire for revenge? And the two names that kept surfacing, whispering through rumor and suspicion, were the last two people anyone expected: Michael Corinthos and Harrison Chase. Both men had long and complicated histories with Willow. Both had deeply rooted grievances with Drew Kane. And both had reasons to want her prepared for something far more dangerous than a spontaneous emotional meltdown. Suddenly, the pieces began to rearrange themselves into a new pattern, a pattern that suggested Willow had not magically acquired this calm, tactical precision. She had been prepared. Someone had shaped her. The theory took on a life of its own when investigators and insiders began to re-examine the way Willow moved the night of the shooting. She didn't fumble with the lock. She didn't hesitate when opening Edward's office. She didn't recoil at touching the safe or handling the weapon. Her motions were fluid, practiced, almost professional, nothing like the behavior of a woman acting on pure panic. Willow had always seemed fragile, gentle, and conflict avoidant. Yet the woman who committed the burglary and the shooting was something else entirely. She moved with purpose. She moved with intention. She moved like someone who had rehearsed every step. That was when suspicion shifted toward Michael. He had always been strategic, always been protective, always been willing to bend moral lines when the situation demanded it, especially when his family or his children were involved. His resentment toward Drew wasn't exactly subtle. Even before the shooting, the tension between them had been simmering beneath the surface. Michael blamed Drew for things nobody had spoken aloud: disruptions, disappointments, failures of judgment that affected Wiley and Amelia. To Michael, Drew had become an obstacle, a problem, a threat. If Michael believed that eliminating Drew or framing him or neutralizing him would secure his children's future, would he have hesitated? Some thought not. But then there was Chase, disciplined, trained, authoritative, and with a deep emotional history tied to Willow. Chase knew how to handle weapons, how to move silently, how to plan an operation down to the smallest detail. And Chase had watched Willow deteriorate emotionally under Drew's influence, had seen her fear, her confusion, her desperation. Chase, who once loved her fiercely, might have believed he was protecting her by preparing her for what he saw as an inevitable confrontation. Worse, he might have believed Willow needed to reclaim power. If Chase had become convinced that Drew was manipulating or harming her psychologically, would he have taken matters into his own hands by teaching her how to defend herself? And would that training, once lit, have turned into something Willow used at the worst possible moment? This possibility, this new adjustment in the story revealed an undercurrent of simmering hatred that neither Willow nor her mysterious mentor had ever expressed openly. But hatred doesn't always announce itself with fire. Sometimes it grows slowly, quietly, feeding off every slight, every betrayal, every fear, until it becomes a shadow draped over every thought and action. And Willow, who had been unraveling under the weight of Drew's control, seemed increasingly like someone carrying more than her own emotions, someone carrying the emotions of another, someone who had been convinced that Drew was a danger, someone who had been guided into believing that the only escape was through force. This raised yet another terrifying layer. What if Willow and her trainer Michael or Chase shared a mutual obsession with the idea of taking Drew down? What if the hatred wasn't hers alone? What if someone had fed that hatred, nurtured it, fanned it into flame? The cracks in Willow's story became more pronounced as this theory grew. Her trembling in the car did not erase the fact that she had been unnaturally calm earlier. Her emotional collapse after the shooting did not erase the meticulous execution of the plan before it. Someone had molded her into the version of herself that entered the Quartermain mansion that night. And that molding was not a what-I'm conversation. It was training. It was conditioning. It was preparation. The idea that Willow suddenly became this tactical, controlled version of herself without guidance felt increasingly impossible. Only someone who understood weapons, psychology, and the stakes of the situation could have orchestrated her transformation. Michael, with his strategic mind and desperate desire to protect his children, or Chase, with his law enforcement background and unresolved feelings for Willow either. Man could have been the architect behind her. With this new obsession rising, this fixation on discovering who shaped Willow's actions, the narrative shifted into something far more sinister. The whispers of the investigation, the shifting glances between characters, the subtle tension whenever Willow walked into a room, all of it indicated that the truth was closing in, that someone else's involvement was inevitable. This wasn't just Willow breaking under pressure. This was Willow being sculpted into a weapon by someone who had every reason to despise Drew. And as the suspicion grew stronger, the danger grew with it. Because if someone had trained Willow once, they could manipulate her again. If someone had orchestrated the shooting, they could orchestrate something even worse. And if Willow's heart and mind were being influenced by a hidden mentor, then the story was no longer just about her guilt, it was about the toxic alliance forming in the shadows. This was the new adjustment. This was the new obsession. This was the rise of a darker truth inching its way toward the surface, proving that whatever happened that night was not an isolated act, but part of a growing, festering hatred shared between Willow and whoever had been whispering instructions into her ear. Port Charles had only begun to understand how deep this conspiracy went, and the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. The real threat was not just Willow's actions, but the person standing behind her, shaping her into something she never intended to become. Drew was unraveling in ways he had never experienced before, and the fear coiled inside him like a living thing he could neither fight nor escape. Every second felt heavier than the last, every breath sharper, every thought darker, because the realization had finally sunk deep into his bones. He was no longer dealing with the aftermath of a single gunshot, nor with the emotional chaos of a desperate woman making a terrible mistake. He was dealing with a hunter, a strategist, a shadow that had been moving silently behind Willow, shaping her, preparing her, turning her into a weapon long before Drew ever understood he was the target. And the more he replayed the moments leading up to the shooting, the more he studied Willow's movements, her precision, her eerie calm, the more he recognized that she had not acted alone. Someone else, hidden, calculating, merciless, had been standing just behind her. Not physically but psychologically, whispering instructions, feeding her motives, pushing her to pull the trigger. The cold truth was that Willow's shot was not the beginning of the story. It was the middle of something deeper, darker, and still active. Drew could not shake the feeling that he was living on borrowed time. He felt the danger everywhere, in the shadows of the hallway, in the stillness of night, in the way the air seemed to shift whenever he was alone. Panic was something Drew had always believed he could manage, something he had survived on battlefields and in far worse environments than Port Charles. But this was different, because he was not facing a faceless enemy. He was facing someone who had studied him, who had used someone he cared about, someone who understood exactly where to strike and how hard to hit, to ensure maximum psychological devastation. The trainer, this unseen architect, was not finished. In fact, Drew could feel that everything up until now had only been the setup. He had been wounded once, but the thought that chilled him most was the growing certainty that the attacker, or the one who trained Willow, fully intended to strike again. And this time they would not settle for leaving him alive. It was the kind of certainty that did not come from logic but from instinct. The primal awareness that danger was closing in like a tightening circle. Drew's thoughts spiraled, replaying the night of the shooting over and over. The way Willow had broken into the Quartermain mansion with unnatural calm. The way she had stolen the gun with no hesitation. The way she had fired to precise shots without trembling. And then the way she fell apart in the car afterward, sobbing so violently she nearly crashed. The split between those two versions of Willow was too sharp, too unnatural, too orchestrated to be accidental. The trainer had done more than teach her how to shoot. They had conditioned her to execute the plan with icy discipline and then collapse afterward. A collapse that ensured she would be too emotionally shattered to question what she had done, or who had pushed her into doing it. Drew realized with mounting horror that Willow might have been manipulated, without even understanding it. She had been trembling in the car, but in the mansion she had moved like a soldier. The trainer had created the perfect puppet, someone capable of committing violence, yet emotionally fragile enough to take the blame alone. But what frightened Drew was not Willow's role, it was the trainer's silence afterward. Whoever trained her did not show themselves. They did not confess. They did not interfere with the investigation. They simply disappeared into the backdrop of Port Charles, leaving Willow to face the consequences while they watched from the shadows, analyzing, recalibrating, preparing for whatever came next. And Drew could feel the recalibration happening. The new adjustment was everywhere, in the way objects in his home seemed subtly moved, in the whisper of footsteps behind him that vanished when he turned, in the darkness outside his windows lingering longer than usual, in the voice on the other end of silent phone calls, breathing but saying nothing. Each detail was small enough to be dismissed individually, but together formed a suffocating pattern. He was being stalked. The trainer had not abandoned the mission, they were extending it. The first attack had failed, the second would not. And if Willow had failed to kill him, the trainer might very well come themselves. Drew had once thought he could control the situation by holding Willow's secret over her, using it as leverage to force obedience, loyalty, silence. But now that leverage had transformed into a curse. By threatening her, by pushing her into a corner, he had placed himself in the crosshairs of someone far more dangerous, someone who would not tolerate interference, someone who saw Drew not just as an obstacle, but as a target who needed to be removed entirely. The realization hit him like a blow. If the trainer believed Drew was becoming a threat to Willow, or to the plan, they would eliminate him without hesitation. The fear turned into paranoia as Drew became hyper-aware of every vulnerability in his life. The unlocked door, the open window, the routine walk to his car, the quiet moments in his office when the lights flickered just slightly too long. He imagined the trainer watching him from a distance, calculating angles, studying his habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And as the fear intensified, it transformed into a suffocating belief that an attack was imminent. Drew could not shake the vision of another gun, another burst of pain, another night of chaos, but this time, the shot would not spare him. He began to imagine scenes that felt like premonitions. A bullet tearing through the darkness outside his door. A figure emerging from the shadows along the docks. A gun pressed to his back in an empty parking garage. Each scenario felt real, almost prophetic, because whoever trained Willow had already shown their method. They were patient, invisible, disciplined, and brutally effective. Drew's near-death experience had not been a failure from their perspective. It had been a trial run. And the next attempt would be the final execution. The more Drew thought about it, the more he realized that this looming violence was not just about him. It was about the chaos that would follow. If he were shot again, if he were killed, it would ignite a political, legal, and emotional wildfire in Port Charles. Nina would unravel. Willow would collapse. Michael would become a suspect again. Sonny would intervene. Carly would go to war. Chase would launch a full investigation. The entire city would fracture along invisible fault lines that had been building for months, turning one man's death into the spark of a catastrophe no one could contain. And Drew felt himself sinking into the awful truth. The trainer might have planned for that outcome. The shooting wasn't just an attempt on his life. It was a destabilization tactic, a way to push the city into chaos, to force fractures in alliances, to manipulate emotional relationships into total collapse. Killing Drew wouldn't just end his life, it would tear the lives of everyone connected to him apart. And that realization was the most terrifying of all. Drew understood then that he was not being hunted by someone driven by anger or revenge. He was being hunted by someone who wanted destruction, someone who understood the ripple effects of violence, someone who saw him not as a man but as a catalyst. The trainer wanted him gone because his death would unleash a chain reaction, far bigger than any courtroom drama or custody battle. Willow had been the first phase. The second phase was coming, and Drew knew with cold certainty that if he did not uncover the trainer's identity soon, he would not survive the next attack and Port Charles would burn in the aftermath.